Youyang here. He's going to talk about his remarkable COVID-19 projections. So, a quick intro to Youyang. He's an independent data scientist and creator of COVID-19 projections.com. His site has been widely cited by various organizations, including the CDC, to help public health decision making. Prior to his COVID 19 modeling work, Youyang honed his research skills as a quantitative researcher in trading and finance. His expertise is in using machine learning to understand data, separate signal from the noise, and make accurate predictions. Youyang completed his bachelor's degree at MIT, double majoring in electrical engineering and computer science and mathematics. He also received his master's degree at MIT, completing his thesis as part of the Natural Language Processing Group at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. You can find him on Twitter via @YouYangGu. Okay, so that is our esteemed speaker. We also have an esteemed guest, which is Professor Vivek Farias from MIT. Vivek, if you want to just say hello.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see all these, so many of your faces after, not seeing all of you live for so long.
So thank you both for joining us. Youyang has promised that he's going to have a couple times in his talk when he will invite questions, but in general, he's open to people unmuting themselves and asking questions or typing something in the chat. And Vivek, of course, is especially invited to give his comments and questions. Okay, so and generally we have a tight timeline, so we don't want to get too far derailed during the talk, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for additional discussion. Okay, so and by the way, in the chat box, we have pasted the link to our seminar website as well as for the mailing list, or we will do that in a moment. So if anybody is interested, we have Juliet Shore, who's a renowned gig economy expert, will be speaking next week. Okay, without further ado, the floor is yours, Youyang.
All right, thanks, Yash, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Vivek, for joining as well. Yeah, my name is Youyang. So today I'm just going to give a presentation about my model, COVID-19-projections.com, and how we use machine learning to forecast future COVID-19 infections and deaths. So I know everyone comes from kind of a wide variety of backgrounds and disciplines. So I'll try to kind of introduce a lot of the fundamentals and feel free to kind of ask questions along the way. So here's the overall outline. So I'll just kind of give a quick intro about the current state of the pandemic, and then we'll go into how my model works and how well it's performed. And then maybe some of the lessons that I've learned along the way, and finally an outlook for the future. So for those of you who have not seen my website, it's COVID-19-projections.com. We have projections for for all 50 states and over 70 countries, as well as 34 US counties. So the bottom right is a map of kind of all the countries that our projections cover. And so they currently account for over 95% of all global reported COVID-19 deaths. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. We make these projections on a daily basis, all the way up until November 1st. A little bit about me. I think I know like Yash already introduced me, but yeah, I'm a data scientist. My specialty is using machine learning to make predictive models. So I did my undergrad and master's at MIT. My master's thesis was on applying deep neural networks to natural language processing. And the reason I kind of started on this COVID project was because I've been following various models through March, and I just noticed that some of the models that were kind of highlighted in the media looked a bit unrealistic. So I just wanted to kind of apply my own background and take my own shot at creating a model that I hope to be more accurate and more realistic. So here's the current state of COVID-19. You can see that for those of you who kind of haven't been following closely, you can see kind of cases and deaths have kind of largely plateaued and now maybe kind of on the decline. But I think deaths will probably remain at a high level at around 1,000 deaths per day for at least the next few weeks, which is of course unfortunate. And so here's what our website would look like for each region. We have kind of 6 different plots for our projections. So we have kind of projections for our deaths and the reproduction number, which I'll go over. And then on the right side is kind of our estimate of how many people have been infected daily and currently, and kind of at any point in time is the bottom right. Okay, so the underlying basis of our modeling is called the SEIR. So now we're going to go into the model itself. So we use what's called SEIR, and it's a classic epidemiology model used to model infectious diseases. So SEIR stands for S is susceptible. So that's in the beginning of a pandemic. It's basically the entire population. And then you have exposed. So that's the E. So that's people who just contracted the virus, but they may not be infectious yet because there is a incubation period. Next, you move to the infectious stage. So in which case an individual is infectious and can transmit the disease to others. And then finally, if an individual is infected, they will either end up passing away or they will recover. So if they recover, then we assume that they have some kind of immunity that will prevent them from getting infected again. So that's kind of what kind of the SEIR stands for. And in traditional epidemiology, I think what's used to do this SEIR model is through differential equations. But for me, I come from a more computer science background, so we like to use more kind of a state machine or discrete state machine representation. And so that's kind of the how I've chosen to implement the SEIR simulator. And so what this simulator that I implemented, what it does is it takes as input a single set of parameters, and it will simulate number of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths for every single day, and use that as the output. And so it does not use any real data, right? So this is all simulations based on the set of parameters that we provided. And I'll go over in a bit, go over kind of what parameters and go over more details, but as a high level, that's kind of how a simulator works. And then we will later apply machine learning to kind of learn what the best parameters is. So that's kind of on a high level how this SEIR model works. And so we'll go over more detail in a bit, but at this point, does anyone have any questions about kind of how SEIR works? Okay, cool.
I have a question, Youyang. So at what level of granularity do you have SEIR parameters? I mean, they presumably vary from one city to the next and so on, right?
Yeah. So I'll go over the kind of the parameters and things in a bit. So hopefully that will answer your questions. So the data source that we use is daily reported deaths from Johns Hopkins University. So unlike many other models, that's the only data source that we use. We don't use any other sources in our modeling. So for example, cases, hospitalization, testing data, those, we don't use that. With that said, I look at those on a daily basis for analysis purposes. But due to kind of the noise in the data for kind of cases and hospitalizations and testing, I don't think they are kind of as useful as deaths in terms of the modeling itself. And so for now, kind of, I believe that deaths are the most consistent, but from region to region. And so that's important when we're kind of doing the modeling. And so that's why I made the decision to kind of only use deaths for all of our training. So does anyone have any questions regarding the data source? Okay. So now there's the overview of kind of our entire pipeline, entire process, right? So as we kind of touched upon earlier, at the base, at the bottom, as the foundation, we have this SEIR simulator, which takes as input a set of parameters and then outputs a kind of simulated infections and deaths per day. And so we build a machine learning layer on top, which takes these, which gives it, generates thousands of different parameter sets, and then takes the resulting simulated deaths per day and compares it with the observed daily deaths as reported by Johns Hopkins. So then what it does is it basically tries to learn kind of what parameter sets generates deaths that most closely matches the observed data. And so it will then use those parameters to forecast and generate projections into the future. So this is kind of the high level diagram of how our model works to generate future projections. So I'll then kind of go over the details over the next few slides, but that's just the overview.
Hey, Youyang, I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like a quick follow actually to Yash's question from earlier. So totally get the point with the DATS data being sort of the most reliable in some sense.
Right.
So I guess our question is though, from the perspective of actually coming up with a forecast, right? Mm. What are, in your perspective, what are interesting things to forecast in the first place?
Yeah. So I think when I started this project, it seems like people are concerned about both cases and deaths, but I think from among those two, I think people care the most about just how many people will die from COVID-19, and whether or not that's the best metric to measure how the impact of the virus is something that I don't want to kind of debate into, but at least kind of from a high level perspective, I think deaths are what most people care about. And so that's why we are kind of, our goal is to use past reported deaths to predict future reported deaths.
So so if you let me, right, like a quick follow up to that. Mm-hmm. I mean, in some ways, right, like one thought with these forecasts is to say, hopefully, right, you're forecasting the future. So maybe this lets you kind of do something that makes it easier to kind of manage what the fallout of all of this is, right? Mm-hmm. And so from that perspective, I wonder what your thoughts are with respect to trying to actually forecast cases, right? So like as you think about various states, right, positioning resources, in their hospitals in various areas to be able to manage. Right, like so one thing we know from COVID is, right, like at least for the serious cases, appropriate healthcare makes a dramatic difference to outcomes, right? So I mean, as opposed to sort of saying, hey, that's inevitably what's going to happen. That's going to change if you provide these people proper care, right? And so if you take one step back and you say, okay, well, you know what, I'm going to try and understand cases, right? I'm going to understand. And in fact, maybe I try to understand cases, and where these cases come up and so forth. Perhaps there's something you can do with that, right? You can sort of say, oh, hey, these hospitals are running out of ventilators. Let's move some ventilators there. Or these guys are, right? And so I guess just being constructive about it. If you have something for deaths, have you given thought to, not just looking at deaths, but then maybe backing out from that, something that helps these folks that are kind of thinking about positioning resources and such things in advance of what's to come?
Yeah, no, I understand kind of what you're saying. I think I've also heard from kind of many people, especially in kind of the healthcare industry, where people are concerned more about hospitalizations rather than deaths, and so but right, given kind of my limited resources as a single person. Right now, I can only focus on kind of a limited amount of forecasting, but I think there are other groups out there that are forecasting hospitalizations and they are forecasting cases and things of that nature. So I definitely think that there's kind of a lot of interest in that as well.
Can I ask a question also?
Sure.
So again, given that you just focus on using past death data to predict future deaths, how does that account for things like either changes in government policy or changes in the behavior of individuals and so on that may change outcomes going forward?
So that is something that I will talk about in a bit, but like policy changes and behavior changes, that's something that can be modeled through the reproduction number. And so I will talk about that in a bit, but so I think that's what you're asking about. So is that correct? Okay. So first, I think people are probably wondering what are these parameters into our SEIR model, and so we have 13 of them right now, and so a couple of them I've listed. So the basic reproduction number, which I'll talk about in a bit, the mitigation date, the lockdown date, the lockdown reproduction number. Rate of infection, daily imports, kind of when region reopens, and then kind of what the reproduction number after reopening is. So these are kind of the parameters that we want to learn for every single region. And these are parameters that are unique to every single region. So therefore, we cannot kind of hard code these values, and we would ideally allow the machine to kind of fit these values such that it most closely matches the observed data. But before we can do any of that, we have to kind of have some initial constants for this virus and how it spreads over time. And so these are not parameters per se, because they're kind of most widely agreed upon, widely accepted values, and are constant from region to region. So for example, an incubation period of 5 days, and then an infectious period of about a week. So these are all just kind of constants that help us kind of simulate what's going to happen in every region.
Can I ask a question? Sorry.
Yeah,
Can I ask
yeah.
a question? So you mentioned that the parameter there is the serial interval, right? The serial interval is the time between symptoms of the index case and symptoms of an offspring, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's affected by your interventions as well, right? So if you're doing contact tracing, the serial interval is going to shorten significantly.
I think the serial interval is a fixed constant of the virus itself, and it's not a function of kind of the intervention. But that's my understanding.
What's the definition of the serial interval that you use? What does serial interval represent in your model?
So a serial interval is kind of basically an estimate of kind of when a person shows the first person shows symptoms and then when the person they infect, right, the next stage, when they begin to show symptoms, right? So for this particular virus, because transmission happens right around the time symptoms on onset, the serial interval is actually very close to the incubation period, because basically roughly around half of transmissions occur before symptom onset, and then half of transmission occurs after symptom onset. So that's kind of the rough high level explanation for this.
But you agree that the interventions that would, for example, put people in in quarantine 24 hours after symptom onset will shorten the serial interval, right? According to the definition you provided.
That's not something that I've looked into. So we assume that kind of the infectious period of transmission occurs between day 2 after exposure to around day 9 after exposure. So.
Okay.
I have a question too. So hospitalization rate of 3%. There's some underlying assumption about asymptomatic. And asymptomatic seems like one of the trickiest things to estimate with this disease. Do you want to comment on this? And a second question is about heterogeneity. If you're worried about the fact that the disease affects different populations very differently, is that something you think about?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's it's a very big question for the heterogeneity one, but hospitalization rate. I mean, I actually currently don't forecast hospitalizations, but it is a possibility. It is supported by the model, so you can change the 3% to whatever percent you want. That's just an example that I gave.
One of the things, just kind of chiming in on the earlier thing from Marcelo to Youyang. I think one of the things a lot of modelers have seen, and Youyang, feel free to comment on this, right? Is essentially when you look at the parameter that you just asked about, Marcelo, the overall forecasts end up being reasonably robust to that, right? So actually, different folks have kind of used different numbers. Like Youyang sort of has 5 days. Other folks that use like 4, whatever, right? There's and it actually it moves things, but like somewhat more second order. I don't know what your thinking on that is, Youyang, as a broader question, right? If you look at the stability of your model to what you're calling initial constants over here, right? And that applies obviously to both Marcelo's question and Ilan's question. What is your sense of which of these are relatively kind of, it's okay to get them right more or less, and others where your predictions change dramatically if if you get it wrong by just a bit. Like, could you say a little bit about how sensitivity with respect to these?
No, I can. So yeah, for all of these constants that you're seeing on the slide here, you can adjust it to a different number, and it will not significantly affect the results. So that's just from empirically, just my observations from working on this data. What will affect the results are these parameters that you see here. These are the ones that are important. So that's just something to keep in mind.
I have one question, which is, it seems that since you're calibrating this off of deaths, effectively what you're doing with your SEIR framework effectively is you're coming up with a probability distribution for the time from infection until death for those who die. And obviously there needs to be an assumption in there for the mortality rate. And so basically what you have, if you kind of abstract away everything, it's really just a convolution. What you have is there is a process at which people are getting infected over time, and then deaths are lagging the infections by a probability distribution from infection until death. And there are, plenty of statistical methods out there which effectively just focus on trying to do that deconvolution, of course, conditional on assuming that you know what that probability distribution is. And it looks to me in many ways like you're doing in some sense the same thing. It's just that the way you're creating the probability distribution is by by the pathway of this SEIR model. But, you already have time from exposure to death. And when you say exposure, I'm presuming you mean infection. So if you have time from infection until death is approximately 22 days, then that would already suggest that a first order model for you would be to say that if I take a look at the number of people who die on a given day, that's essentially roughly the number of people who got infected 3 weeks earlier times the fraction that die. And now you have to put, the randomness around that. But that's basically the dynamics which is going on. It's a lag from infection until death, and you're working backwards. Have I got that right?
Yeah, no, that's basically the rest of my talk. So
okay, well, no, but just the reason I mention it then is because there are other attempts to do what's called nowcasting as opposed to forecasting. But basically, the idea is that if you think you understand these delayed distributions to various indicators, so deaths, of course, is a good one because people feel that the mortality data is more accurate than case data, that it's not as affected by changes in testing policy and so forth. The problem with deaths is that it's a very lagging indicator. It's hard to find an indicator which is going to lag longer. What you really want to know is the actual real-time infection process. Once you have a model that says how many people are being infected over time, then everything's going to follow from that. The questions Vivek was asking earlier about how many people are going to be affected seriously and up in the hospital, or what Marcelo asked earlier about if you actually put some kind of a policy in place, what's that going to do to the incidence rate? You're going to be chopping off a certain percentage of infections and stop them from happening because of quarantine, isolation, and so on. So I'm just wondering, and I'll stop you. Like I want to let you give your talk, but it's just how critical is this whole SEIR structure versus, you could say, look, really what we have is this probability distribution of time from infection into a mortality. And, if we think we know what that probability distribution is, then in some sense, it's how do we do the best possible deconvolution? And that's what you end up with. And that would be like trying to establish the past history of incidents. The assumptions you're going to need is if you go into the forecasting part, right? It's like, because we don't know what infections would be going forward without some kind of a model.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. I think I thought about this as well, and I think the SEIR component is important in being able to create the forecasting rather than the nowcasting, because if you only use deaths and do the deconvolution, you're getting what is the state of the disease 4 weeks, 3 weeks ago. And so that's why I kind of the next slide I'll continue is understanding the reproduction number and how that changes over time is important to making future forecasts for both infections and deaths, right? So I won't kind of skip over this, but for the reproduction number, if R is greater than 1, then transmission is increasing. If R is less than 1, then transmission is decreasing. So we want to be able to know kind of the effective reproduction number, right? The RT at any given point in time. And so that's what we will eventually model in our SEIR simulator. So here's kind of the process for that. So we have we first kind of given a set of parameters, right? So we first compute the reproduction number, the RT, for every single day. And then we can use that to generate the number of new infections per day. And then on the side, we need to generate the infection fatality rate per day based on for the infections, right? So then we can combine the IFR with the number of new infections to get the number of new deaths per day after accounting for this kind of time to death lag. So that's kind of the overview of the SEIR component specifically. So I'll just go over that. So first we generate the RT curve over time. And so to do that, we have 3 parameters: the R naught, the initial basic reproduction number, the post mitigation R. So that's kind of the R after lockdown or after mitigation measures. So for in the US, that's usually in March. And then we have the reopening R, so what the R value is after a state or a country reopens. And so we expect that to be kind of higher than the post-mitigation R. And so we have these three values, and then we just kind of smooth it with a sigmoid function. And so that's how we can generate this RT curve over time. So here's an example of RT curve for New York and Florida. You can see that kind of New York, you had a much higher R naught, but it's mostly kind of remained under 1 for the since then, or around 1 since then. But Florida, on the bottom plot, you can see that kind of after reopening, they really saw kind of a sharp increase in the transmission, and that's reflected in kind of our value.
Youyang, super quick question for you. So again, as you do this RT stuff, you're doing it based entirely on deaths?
Yeah. So this is just the simulator itself, so it doesn't have any actual data.
Right. No, I get that. But when eventually you're kind of backing something out, you're going to learn the RT, right? So the thing that you're backing into this is basically just deaths. You're not actually going to fit this to case reports as well.
Yeah, no cases, no hospitalizations.
So that leads to kind of another super quick follow-up question. Not that this is relevant to the task of forecasting deaths, but again, right, like to for instance, to this point of like interventions and things like that. I mean, a lot of folks that have been focused on RT, right? Say at least in the spirit of like nowcasting, like how are things looking right now? So imagine if I looked at the RT that was under the hood in your model, that would be a function of like basically the assumptions you made earlier on how long it takes for somebody to kind of essentially die from this.
Mm-hmm.
That it would be quite sensitive to that. That is to say, there'd be like a translation that would be sensitive to that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think so. Right. So the next part is how we compute infections from the RT value. And I think
actually, if you let me, another quick question that might be broadly interesting, right? Like, so, there's another site, right, that's sort of gotten a lot of traction around just reporting RT, right? And my understanding is it's, some kind of Kalman filter that's focused very much on cases, right? And testing and things like that, adjusting for testing, all these sorts of things. And what they advertise is an RT curve, right? By state, by whatever. Have you actually compared, out of curiosity, right, the RTs that you have and the RTs that, are you aware of the site that I'm talking about, first of all?
Yeah.
So have you compared like those RTs with your RTs? Right? Because there's a lot of like policymakers that are actually looking at this, right? They'll actually literally look at the RT and they'll sort of, use it in a way that's convenient to them. Right? Like, oh, look, it's below 1, or oh, look,
I've taken a look in the past, but I haven't really focused too much on it because their methods are very different than my methods. So I mean, I think it's good if you want to look at what the RT value is to kind of use a variety of different resources, right? So we're not kind of I guess the point I want to make is that, right, like we're not trying to model. We're not trying to most accurately model the RT value, right? We're trying to model deaths, right? We're trying to forecast deaths. So that's the part of our model that is the most important part, and then we make certain assumptions, within our modeling such that we can most accurately forecast deaths, right? So that's kind of the differentiation there. So now going back to kind of how we compute infections, I left this slide on for a while, so I think most of you have probably read through the example, but yeah, it's just you're just convoluting the kind of the probability distribution of how likely a person will get infected on each day with the RT value and the number of new infections per day. So the next part is we have to estimate the fatality rate. And so prior to May, we used just the constant 1% IFR for across the US. In the top right corner, I made this plot kind of back in April showing that kind of our model, we tried different values of the IFR, and we found that around 1% would give kind of the lowest out of sample error in our forecasting. But what happened is, starting kind of in May, our model was over projecting the number of deaths in the U.S. And so, when we looked into this, we realized that it looks like that the IFR has been decreasing over time, and that's likely kind of our best guess as to kind of why kind of this phenomenon is happening. And so since kind of May, we use a variable IFR for every single region. And then we decrease the IFR kind of on a daily basis until it's about 30% of what it was before. And so now I don't now whether this is actually true or not is again kind of goes back to my previous point, is I'm not. The goal is to kind of forecast deaths, and so for me, like using this the plot I see on the bottom right as the IFR estimate, it seems to work best in terms of predicting future deaths. Whether or not this is actually the case is something that obviously needs more research. But I have been doing some analysis, and I posted kind of a report about it, and there does seem to be evidence that suggests that kind of this implied infection fatality rate has been decreasing over time in the past few months, and that could be attributed to improving treatments. But I think another important factor is the fact that the median age of infection has decreased. And so if you look at this plot, just computed from the CDC, you can see that there's been kind of a significant uptick in the share of positive tests, confirmed tests in the 18 kind of through 49 age group since May. And so that's something that kind of does indicate that would lead to kind of a lower IFR, because I think people in age 18 to 49 are about like 20 to 50 times less likely to die compared to individuals above the age of 65. So that could certainly be a factor in the lower IFR. And then, so finally, we can do another convolution on the deaths, as we've heard kind of a few minutes ago. Again, we'll go into kind of the details, but you simply have a probability distribution of when we expect an individual to die, and then we just take the convolution of that with the number of infections, then the fatality rate. So I just gave a simple example of a virus with a fatality rate of 40%. That's just as a example, but we can then, after the convolution, we can then kind of estimate the number of deaths for every single day in our SEIR simulation. So that's the overview of our SEIR simulator. We have given a parameter set where we generate the RT, generate the infections, generate the IFR, and then ultimately we output the number of new deaths per day. So anyone have any questions about the SEIR section?
Oh, just a moment. So there was a question from Ed Kaplan in the chat. He says you're talking, I think, about RT.live, that is based on cases. The theory behind RT is based on incidence of infections. They give different results as most infections are not detected as cases. The COVID STIM site first estimates incidence and then uses that to estimate RT.
Yeah, that was why that was to my question, I think, from earlier, right? And that was why I raised it, actually, right? That was exactly why I raised it. I mean, in over time, the RT.live guys have done a bunch of things to adjust for exactly that issue, right? That is, you have cases, how does this, how does testing matter and so forth. And I think, whereas the first version, in their defense was pretty rough, it's pretty decent today. which is why, but maybe, yeah, there are other perhaps yet other benchmarks to look at for RT. So it's great point in the chat, Ed.
Okay. Yeah, no, I agree with what you guys discussed. So let's go on to the next slide. I think we only have about like 10 or so minutes left, so we'll try to power through the remaining presentation. But so the next part is, right, we need a loss function to compare the daily deaths generated by our SEIR simulator with the observed reported deaths, the true deaths from Johns Hopkins. And so we just use very simple mean squared error. So here is just an example that we provide with a kind of a true versus simulated. And so in this case, right, we would prefer parameter set B because it results in a lower mean loss. So then this, the machine learning layer we applied then simply uses grid search. So it tries basically every combination within kind of an interval for all the different parameters. And so it tries for each parameter set, it tries, provides the parameter set to the simulator to get a simulated deaths, and then it computes a loss from that. And so we usually use about a few thousand different parameter sets for each region. And so that will give us kind of a few thousand different losses or different errors for our grid search. And to make our projections, we simply...
Yeah, if I could stop you really quickly on that slide. Could you go back one? So when you say I'm sorry, the slide you were on with the grid search. So when you say 3 RT values, I'm not quite following what you mean by that. Does are 3 RT curves? Is that what you're saying?
No. So remember, when we build the RT curve, we only actually use three values: the R naught, the post mitigation R, and then the reopening R. And then we smooth that with a sigmoid to generate kind of a value of RT for every single date.
Oh, I see. So what you're saying is your RT curve is parameterized by a given RT curve is parameterized by 3 values.
Exactly. So that's why, again, like this RT live side, they are much more parameterized than our side.
Yeah.
We only have three values, and that's on purpose because we don't want to kind of really overfit on any particular on the data. So
it's very clear. Thank you.
So yeah, that's a good question. And so finally, we just kind of combine, right, all the different simulations that our model projects based on kind of a weighted score of their losses. Right? So first, we just kind of take the top 7% of all the parameters based on the loss, and then we can kind of sort the projections to get kind of our confidence interval. And then our mean estimate is kind of just the weighted mean based on the error. So there's kind of a lot of different ways you can go about computing kind of the confidence interval and then the mean and things like that. And all of that detail is kind of on my website. But for now, that's kind of just a rough overview. And then for the US nationwide, we just kind of combine the confidence intervals for each state to get our US estimates. So does anyone have any questions on that? Okay, cool. So that's basically the gist of how how we make forecasts. That is kind of the rough overview where we combine the SEIR simulator with the machine learning portion to get future forecasts. And so some of the advantages of this is that it is fast. So we can generate our projections in under an hour on the laptop. And so the faster we can generate projections, and the quicker I can iterate through different ideas. Frequent, we make projections every day. And so that allows us to kind of adjust to new data daily and kind of respond more quickly to different scenarios. And then the last part, I think is probably the most important, is that it's flexible. So we make projections for all states and over 70 countries and 30 counties. And the idea is that if I have any idea or kind of new implementation idea, I want to make sure that kind of it can be applied broadly across every single region, right? So that we're not overfitting on one or two states or kind of one or two countries. We have to make sure that kind of this idea can work broadly across regions and across countries, and so that really helps minimize the amount of overfitting and the amount of overhead and adjustments that I have to make. And so that's kind of the main advantages of having kind of keeping things simple and not over parameterized. And I guess in the last few minutes I have, I'll just kind of quickly go over some evaluations. And so here's just some plots of kind of some of examples of our past projections. On the top, we have some April projections, for example, New York and California. And it has done fairly well predicting the curve there. And so our projections are kind of the blue lined, and then we just use kind of IHME as a benchmark there. And then the bottom left is our Arizona forecast in May, and you can see it does okay, not great, but not terribly. And the bottom right, you can see kind of our forecast for Florida in May kind of missed that steep increase in deaths. So we did project that there would be an increase, but not certainly the level from 30 to 200 that we're seeing now. But you can also notice that even though it's not in our mean estimate, our confidence interval does cover that possibility of a sharp increase in deaths. So that is good to see, even though we kind of missed the mean projection there. And then overall, I just did this analysis this week, but we've been making daily forecasts for August 4th since April 9th.
Yash asked to hold off on questions, but I couldn't. I can't help myself. Did you go back to the previous slide? I imagine this will be interesting to a large set of people, right? So the fact that I think in late May, we sort of a lot of folks, right? Especially managing things on the government side in places like Florida, or we're done with all this, right? And in late May, you're saying no, this could be pretty bad. So prima facie, just in terms of the results, that's great. That's really awesome. What do you think was driving this prediction? Because ultimately, as you said several times, right, the only data that you're kind of actually using over here is deaths. That's it, right? And so as you sort of look at this, what do you think was driving the vast difference, right? In what your model was doing, in Florida versus the other places. And just to add a little more color to the question, right? Lots of hypotheses around oh, you know what, these guys went crazy with people going out to bars and various other things, right? And that kind of accelerated, that accelerated transmission and so forth. Do you think there's something, that this, how much does that, explanation complement, essentially the latent things that are going on in your model, right? In essence, your model has something latent going on, right? That says this is what the infection curve actually is. So you look at that latent infection curve for your model for Florida or Arizona, what are your thoughts on how that squares with the various hypotheses going on for,
So our kind of reopening assumptions. So our forecast rate for reopening is very largely based on our assumptions. So the assumption we made back in May was that we assume after a state reopens that the R value will increase between 0 to 30%. And so for Florida, what happened is our R value estimate, even before reopening.
I missed that actually. I think I missed what you just said earlier. So what is the assumption precisely after reopening?
Yeah, so back in May, we assumed that after reopening, that infection at the R value will increase between 0 to 30%, and then we use our machine learning to determine exactly where in the 0 to 30% it falls under. So what happened for Florida is that the R value before reopening was already very close to 1 because deaths were steady.
And who had reopened in May? It was
most states reopened in May.
Most states had reopened in May. So
with the exception of like New York and California.
I see. Got it.
So that's why we predicted an uptick, right? So because we estimate a mean about 15% increase. So Florida will go from 1 to 1.15 R. We didn't realize that it would actually go from 1 to 1.5. So that's why, you know, we did not kind of project, right, this a steeper curve than what actually we projected. So, yeah, so going back to our, I guess, evaluation, yeah, like 90% of our daily US projections since April 9th for August 4th fell within the 95% confidence interval, or the reported deaths on August 4th fell within the 95% confidence interval for 90% of our projections since April 9th. And if we actually look at, if we just use since April 14th, it's about 94% of the projection. So ideally you want to be at 95, but we were around at 90 to 94%. So could be improved, but not terribly. And then just some historical performance. These are on my website. So these are historical 4-week ahead forecasts for the US, just the comparison of different models. The US forecasts are very, there's a high level of variance because there's only one forecast every week. But if you look at kind of the state by state forecast, there's 51 forecasts every single week. So the variance is much lower. So models that perform well tend to perform well every single week. And then we can see that the ensemble method does very well. It takes kind of the average of all the models on this list. So I guess I don't have time to kind of go over kind of the lessons learned. So I'll kind of just skip over that. But overall, kind of the outlook for the future is, we estimate that a large proportion of the country may be infected, and that will likely continue over the next few weeks, and the next few months. But overall, I think there's a good chance that deaths will continue to decline for the next few weeks and the next few months. It's unclear what the result of the school reopenings and the fall wave and the start of flu season will bring. That's why we're only extending our forecast to November 1st, because honestly, past November 1st, I have no clue what's going to happen. So I don't really want to make any sort of forecast beyond that. And honestly, I don't think anyone has many idea of what's going to happen. So, and that's why if you look at our confidence interval on the upper right, you can see that it really grows over time, and as we get into kind of October and September. So hopefully, though, we end up on the lower side of what we are forecasting in terms of kind of deaths, and so. That's kind of the outlook we currently have, and I'll just wrap it up there. Feel free to check out our website. Everything is our SEIR simulator is open source. All of our projections, all of the data we generate are available online, and then so is our evaluation tool. So I'll wrap it up there. So thank you guys so much for allowing me to present to you guys today, and I'll be happy to take any more questions in the remaining few minutes that we have.
Thank you so much, Youyang. So we can take a few questions now. Please try to be brief with your questions so that we can take a couple extra questions. And I think selfishly really want to learn about the lessons learned. So if Youyang is willing and has a few minutes at 3 o'clock, people can leave, and if you want, you can stay, and maybe we can go over those, because I feel like in some sense he's been able to do a remarkable job with very little information, and I want to learn what tricks does he have up his sleeve, or what sort of uh, wisdom can he share with us. Okay, so the floor is open. I think Siamak had a question, and if Ed is still here after Siamak, he can ask his question.
Yeah, my question was just a clarifying question. Your simulator is entirely deterministic, right? Like with the same parameters, you get the same outputs.
Yes, that is true. There is a little bit of some randomization in there, but we use kind of a seeding so that it is deterministic given the set of parameters.
Ed has potentially left, so anybody else?
Hi, Yash. This is Ken. I have a couple of questions, actually. And it's actually two. One is looking at these confidence intervals is very interesting for these different states looking forward. One question is just, you have several sort of structural parameters explaining why there might be uncertainty about forecasts going forward for a given state, let's say. Do you have a sense of what determines whether the predictions for one state are more uncertain versus less uncertain? Is it because of the variance in the reproduction rate? Is it the size of the susceptible population? What's driving the actual uncertainty? That would be one question.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think part of the uncertainty comes from kind of just right the longer the long time horizon, right? So it's been what six months almost since kind of this pandemic first started, and so because our simulator kind of tracks the entire curve of the pandemic, there can be kind of uncertainty generated from kind of having to keep track that long time span. And so that will kind of, right, so if a state has been reporting about 20 deaths per day for the past few weeks, there will be, I notice, some difficulty of having a simulator kind of generate end up at 20 deaths per day in August exactly. And so this uncertainty comes from sometimes it may be with a set of parameters, it may be 10, sometimes it may be 30. And so it becomes, these parameters become more sensitive over time, because small changes in, for example, the R value can cause larger and larger effects, right? The more time you give it. So that's what primarily drives kind of that uncertainty.
I see. So you're saying it's more, the more data you have on a state, the more idea you have of sort of the behavioral aspects that are driving it or other things. And it's less about New York looking uncertain because there's less of susceptible population there at some point. The second question I had is about how you use the model. Florida, I thought, was an interesting example because you said there was this spike that was in some sense unexpected, but it fell within your confidence interval. I was thinking more, have you thought of using this as sort of a detection mechanism where you're sort of taking as given the policies that are in place and the way people behave, and you have a prediction at a certain point in time, and looking forward, if you see a deviation that falls out of that interval, that tells you something about the effect of policies that have happened since then or other changes. So have you thought about using your model in that sort of way?
Yeah, no, that's a good question as well. I think that's something that I've been thinking about. And if you follow my Twitter, I actually for the past few weeks have been doing some more analysis on kind of looking at the effects of policy and the possible effects of immunity and things like that. But nothing is kind of for certain. And so these are all kind of open-ended questions. And I think there's been a lot of debate actually in the scientific community right now about kind of the role of policy or the role of immunity. And so my job is to kind of just really provide the data and provide the forecast and kind of doing analysis purely from kind of a data-driven perspective. And hopefully that will help kind of lead to new questions and new results and new answers.
So maybe I can ask a question then. So if I understood you correctly, you're building up the national forecast from an aggregation of the state forecast, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you build a confidence interval for each state. So how is the confidence interval for the aggregate being derived from those confidence intervals?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the very right the naive way is to just kind of add up all the confidence intervals to get your confidence interval for the U.S. as a whole. But of course, that would result in a confidence interval for the U.S. that's too wide, right? Because you're kind of assuming, I think, in that case, complete independence, and so we take some steps into kind of narrowing that assumption. So we don't assume complete independence. So that would be just adding up the intervals. I think
actually, I don't think that you would be assuming independence in that case, but
complete is it dependence? It's one of those. If you add up all the confidence interval, I believe that assumes independence.
No. So what are you doing? Rather than talking about things you're not doing, what are you doing?
Yes, I go into more detail on the website, but what you can do is you can kind of the other method is to take the square root of the differences in the intervals compared to the median. But that would assume that would be an assumption of complete dependence based on my understanding, and so we kind of take a median a mixed approach where it's not we don't do the square root, but we don't kind of add them all together. And so I can share you the link to how we compute it offline. But that's kind of how we compute the U.S. intervals.
Mm-hmm.
So can I ask a couple of questions? Okay.
Yeah, so
to check.
I'm request Yunko, is it possible to make it one question, because I wanted to also give him some time to tell us his lessons.
Okay, sure. So maybe quick two questions then, just to compromise. So do you report the forecast of cases? And I'm just curious on what's the magnitude is the undetected number of cases, because you are just working through off the death, and so therefore the forecasted number of cases will differ from the ones that are actually confirmed from actually testing. So there should be huge this discrepancy, and also it will be fluctuating as the positivity rate changes. From in the case of New York, it was very high, now it's very low. So I would imagine that the gap has shrunk. Can I see somewhere in the to see the projection of the cases?
Yeah, so I think by cases you mean the number of infections.
Number of infections,
yeah. We don't.
Number of infections are predicted by your model versus the actual number of cases confirmed.
Yeah, you could. You can. We show number of infections for every region that we have. So you can look at that on our website. And so if you compare that to the number of cases for the U.S., I think we estimate that the ratio is kind of around 10, maybe even more on the infection to case ratio back in March and April. And I think now we estimate a peak of about a little over 400,000 new infections per day in July. And the US reported, I think, like 70,000 cases per day last month. So that ratio is about 6 times. And I think the commonly accepted values range from kind of like 4 to 8 right now, but that can change as we get more data. But for now, I think that 4 to 8 range is a fairly good estimate for the number of true infections to the number of detected cases ratio.
So one quick clarifying question before before I go. Do you actually account for the heterogeneity of the fatality rates across different age groups when you train your simulators?
So somewhat, right? So we assume that, right? So if you go all the way back, we assume that the IFR kind of decreases over time. And the reason, so the bottom right curve here, and we think the reason for that is, of course, there's some level of improved treatments that can lower the true IFR. But I think another reason is because we think that there's kind of a lower median age of infection going on right now.
But you can access data on, and maybe the Johns Hopkins doesn't have this data, but you can access data on the age, the breakdown of ages of the deaths.
Yeah, there's Johns Hopkins doesn't provide that right now, so we only look at everything from an aggregate perspective. But I think there's a lot of groups out there right now that are doing this age stratified infection fatality rate and trying to calculate that. So you know, I look forward to kind of looking to more results over the next few months.
Okay. Well, thank you. Now, Youyang, can we get a few more minutes of your time to learn your lesson?
Yeah. How many more minutes do you think?
I think it's up to you. We have about 20 people who are still on the Zoom, and there's 30 something on YouTube. I don't know, like 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes, whatever. Eh?
All right. Yeah, I'll just kind of talk a bit, and then we'll see where we go from there. So just some lessons learned from kind of the past few months. Number one, focus on the fundamentals. So I think you know, a lot of how I got started was I used some very basic techniques. I think all of the techniques I've introduced in this talk is from is not anything novel or unique. Is all widely established, like the SEIR component and then the basic machine learning with using grid search. So they're all just kind of basic techniques, fundamental techniques, and we want to start from the bottom up, right? So using deaths and work my way up rather than using, you know, many other data sources. So I think that's really important because when you have data like this, where the signal to noise ratio is so low, having these simple fundamental techniques and models can really go a long way in extracting the full amount of signal. And the corollary of that is it helps minimize overfitting, right? So here's a list of different data sources that I've seen other models use. So I just kind of copy and pasted from various other models. And you know, I only use deaths for our modeling. And so you can see that, I mean, like some of them make sense in terms of like, oh, maybe cases and hospitalizations and testing mobility. But once you kind of go down the list, you know, the altitude or air pollution or airline traffic, I mean, like then you're really asking yourself, are you fitting the signal or are you fitting the noise? So that's something that I think people should be aware of when kind of making these type of modeling based on such limited amount of data. Number two, minimize assumptions. So I'm not an epidemiologist, so I don't know much about diseases and viruses before I started the project, and I still don't know that much about it now. So I want to make sure that I'm not making any incorrect or inaccurate assumptions. And so my role is to basically design the model such that it can learn these assumptions for me so that I don't have to you know, make any inaccurate assumptions myself. And then as a corollary of that, we have to be aware of this idea of confirmation bias, where we have evidence that we believe in, and we sometimes may be overconfident in kind of the how true it is. And when new data comes along that kind of goes against our beliefs, sometimes we tend to overlook that new data or ignore it. And so that can cause repercussions down the road. And it's something that, I've certainly found myself falling under that. And I know that, it's possible other people have as well. So I think being aware of this potential bias that, we have and recognizing it and, being able to adjust our priors if new data becomes available that disproves them is really important, especially in a fast-moving environment like what we've seen with COVID. That's number 3 is kind of test your hypothesis, right? So what I've seen over the last few weeks and months is that anyone can make claims or manipulate data to kind of fit the narrative of what they want to believe in. And so it's really important, right, that as scientists that we have, whenever we make these claims or hypotheses, that we are able to provide a way to test them, right? And the only true way is to use kind of true out of sample data in the future. And so, for me, that's kind of the whole basis of kind of my projections and my forecasts is I have a set of assumptions, and if those assumptions are true, then this is what, right, are what we predict that will happen in the future. And if that ends up being wrong, then of course we have to admit that, right, the assumptions that we make are probably are likely not true, and we have to adjust accordingly, right? If you don't make these testable hypotheses, then there's really no way to show whether you're actually right or wrong. And here at the bottom is an example of a plot I think I've seen someone made where right, they simply shifted the cases with the deaths and to show that, I think this plot is from a month ago in July, right, and show that, like at this rate, we're gonna go back up to 2,000 deaths per day by the end of July. And obviously that, right, was not the case. And so as a result of that, right, like we know that, right, this method is clearly not the way to go. And so, but at least, right, like making these testable hypotheses can show us, right, whether you are correct or you are wrong. So I think that's very important in this day and age. That's number 4, engage critics. So this might be a little controversial, but I actually really liked so I use Twitter a lot over the last few months, and I like posting about my kind of my projections, my ideas, my thoughts, and then having people kind of discuss it. And of course, not everyone's going to agree with my ideas, and I welcome that. And so I try to respond to people as much as I can and kind of defend my positions and kind of debate with people. But right, if I realize that it forces you to really think about, right, like what your assumptions are and why you think it's correct, because it goes back to kind of the earlier points about confirmation bias. And so if I'm not able to kind of properly defend my position, then is it really the right claim to be, right? Should I really be making these claims? And so it really helps me understand kind of by engaging with other people, kind of how to think about these problems. And when other people present evidence that, right, like that counters kind of my positions, and I have to be able to acknowledge, right, that when I may be incorrect in some of my assumptions, and that has actually helped me tremendously in improving my model, because I'm not perfect. And so that goes back to lesson number 5, learn from mistakes, right? Not all the assumptions that I made are correct. Not all the projections I made are correct. And so, for example, you may, on the left side, right, we projected 180,000 deaths in the US by August. And of course, that is much higher than what we've actually seen. And so that forced me to adjust my assumptions, right? So that again goes back to having testable hypotheses. And if it's wrong, then you have to fix your assumptions. And so that's when we were using a 1% fixed 1% IFR. And so because of this issue, that forced me to lower my IFR estimate from 1% to kind of a lower IFR. Similar thing on the right side, right? I thought that kind of the deaths in Sweden will continue to increase after kind of they said that they will not lock down, but that was not the case, right? Deaths continue to decline ever since April, and so we're forced to adjust or update our assumptions because our forecasts were not correct. So learning from those mistakes really helps me kind of improve the model and iterate through different ideas quicker than if you were to just stick to an idea and then never deviate from that. So you can see that kind of all these 5 lessons that I kind of listed out here, they all kind of fit together in some shape or form where you've want to avoid these type of pitfalls, and that will help you basically improve your understanding and make more accurate projections. So that's kind of just the 5 lessons that I have here. So happy to take any more questions on that, but hopefully you guys found it useful.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks to Vivek, he's already left, but thanks to him for being a guest, and thanks to all the audience members for being so engaged uh, and attending the talk.
Oh yeah, no, thank you for having me, and thank you for sticking around. And I wish everybody the best.